Feeding tennis balls might seem super simple, but choosing the right feed and executing it well can make or break a drill. Whether you're a coach, player, or parent, mastering different feeding techniques can help players to train smarter, faster, and more effectively. And so in this video, I'm going to give you 8 essential feeding techniques and showing you the perfect times to utilize them in your training sessions. Let's get into it. The first type of feed is a rally or live ball feed, and it's simply hitting back and forth with the player at the other end. This can be done cooperatively or competitively depending on what you're working with. But the reason why this is the most important type of feed and the feed that players should spend most of their time on court receiving is because it's the most realistic to playing a match. Receiving a live ball or rally feed gives you tons of variety, forcing you to have to make decisions. Simple decisions like whether to hit a forehand or a backhand, to move forwards or shift backwards for the ball, really training your anticipation, which, as we know, is vital when it comes to being a good tennis player. It also has the most realistic feeling for the player when they're making contact with the ball. Because you're hitting back and forth, the ball feels exactly the same as it would in a match situation. However, a rally ball feed does have its limitations. For example, if you want to increase the amount of volume you're hitting on a specific shot, or if you're a parent with a lower skill level than your competitive junior, you might struggle to give them match realistic balls. And so this is where the other 7 feed types come in. But before I get into them, it's really important to note that even if you're going to practice with these other ball feeds, your aim should be to get things back to a live ball feed, as this is what the player is going to be experiencing when they're playing matches. The second type of feed is the hand feed. Now this, as you can see, is the most simple to execute. This is where you're going to stand closer to your player and you're simply going to throw the ball up for them to strike. But although this is easy to execute for the feeder, it's the most unrealistic feed type for the player, as the ball's coming from very close proximity. It's traveling very slowly, so they don't feel the impact they would if they were receiving a normal ball speed. But it's also a feed type that I do like to use when I'm coaching. For one, it gets me much closer to the player so that I can give them quick and easy feedback. 2, I can put the ball exactly where I want it. Sometimes that's useful for isolating certain technical elements that we want to work on. And 3, I can give my player less time in between shots, increasing the cardio workout that they're getting. One thing I would say when it comes to hand feeds is to try to make it as realistic as you possibly can. Try to make sure you're feeding from the direction that the ball would be coming from on the court, as I often see parents standing outside of the court near the net post throwing the ball into play. Although they're trying their best to help their child, they're actually making the feeds even more unrealistic than they already were. But if you're standing directly in front of your player, make sure that you get out of the way once you've fed the ball. One great use for hand feeds is training different footwork patterns and trying to get a bit of a workout within your sessions. So feeding from side to side is a great way to increase the challenge level of any drill. To take that to the next level, it would be great to add some variety so that the player has to make some decisions. To start off with, you'll mix up between the forehand and backhand sides like so, and if that gets comfortable for them, you can start to add disguise by throwing the ball like this so they don't know which ball to expect. But as I said before, do this for a short amount of time when you're working on something specific, but aim to make the feeds more and more realistic until you get back to a live ball feed. The third feed type is the standard basket feed, and it's simply you using your racket to feed the ball into your player at the other end. This is possibly the one that you'll see most often in coaching, as it has tons of versatility. You can feed the ball to different parts of the court, you can change your feeding position, and it gives you a little bit of both when it comes to controlling the environment, but also giving some variety. I would say that this is honestly overused, as I like to hit with my player from the back of the court as much as possible to make it more realistic. But it can be a really good way to control things if your player needs to work on something more specific. Now, as I mentioned about feeding from different positions, I would always encourage you to feed from a position specific to the type of ball that your player wants to be receiving. Most of the time, this is going to be from behind the baseline. but this can be technically quite difficult if you have a lower playing level. So feel free to move closer, but understand that this is not quite as realistic as it would be if you were feeding from the back of the court. Just like hand feeds, you can take the player through progressions. Once they get comfortable with you feeding to the same position, then you could add some variety to your feeds, testing their decision making. And to take it up another level, you can mix your feeding positions. For example, if you feed the first ball and your player hits into this corner, you can shift across to feed the next ball from where they've sent that last ball to, making things much more match realistic. The fourth feed type is very similar to the standard basket feed, but this is a drop feed this time. Instead of feeding the ball out of your hand like so, you'll simply let the ball drop before you feed it in. What this does is it allows your player at the other end to work on their timing of things like their split step and their preparation, as they're able to see the ball bounce before you strike it. This is a real drawback for the standard basket feed, as the player at the other end has nothing to read the ball from, whereas as soon as they have a bounce involved, they can see your backswing and they can see the timing of that bounce. This leads us on to the fifth type of feed, which is the topspin feed. And as you can imagine, this makes things far more realistic for the player at the other end. Still feeding from the basket, but instead of using your continental grip and feeding the ball in with a flat trajectory, now we're going to add topspin. This can be done both out of the hand or with a bounce. But clearly, this makes things far more realistic for the player at the other end if they're training to deal with topspin. It's great for getting them used to spacing themselves further from the ball and dealing with that higher bounce. But again, it's starting to get more and more technically difficult. But it's a feed that if you can do it, you really should for those players that need to work on dealing with topspin. However, not all players have to deal with topspin. I work with lots of club players that mainly play players that hit with slice, which leads us on to the next feeding type, slice. The slice feed is great for players that want to work on dealing with those lower, more skiddy balls, but is a bit more technically difficult to execute. I actually tend to feed these with a backhand, as this is how most players are going to receive a slice, and I'll also do it with a bounce, like so. As you can see, these balls are bouncing much, much lower than those heavy topspin ones were. The seventh type of feed is probably my favorite. It's called bounce, and it's simply this. You feed the ball down into your side of the court. Now, what this does, believe it or not, is creates a heavy topspin effect at the other end, but with minimal effort from me, meaning that I can do these over and over again without creating any problems in my wrist, my elbow, and my shoulder, which if I were ripping heavy topspin feeds day in, day out, I'm gonna have issues. This type of feed is really good for players or parents that struggle with that topspin feed. It's much, much easier to execute, giving the player at the other end a much bigger challenge. I actually recently saw Janko Tipsarevic feeding like this to Denis Shapovalov at the Aussie Open, and so it's used for players of all abilities. Just like the other exercises, try to mix up your feeds once your player is used to it. I like to do this with different heights here, so I'll feed a low one, a high one, a slower one, or a faster one. And you can just imagine how difficult that is to receive at the other end. The final type of feed is super important, and it's a serve feed. Now, this feed can be done in many different ways. The most basic way is from the normal serving position, just serving to your player at the other end. Because the return of serve is the second most important shot in tennis after the serve, it's vital that you train it in every session. And I actually think that shot is really under-practiced. So if you're a coach or a parent or a hitting partner, practice your serving feeds. It's really, really important. But a little hack that can help your serve feeds to go over and in more frequently for the player at the other end, and to make them more challenging, is to change your position. You can stand up at 3/4 here, which makes it much, much easier for you to direct your serve and get it in, but also it gives the player at the other end less time to react, really heightening their senses and their anticipation. And of course, you can take that up a level by serving from the service line here. What I would say though is if you're a tall player serving from the service line, this can become a little bit unrealistic with those serves bouncing really, really high. So try to manipulate that serve feed to keep it at a realistic trajectory. In fact, there is a funny story. a few years ago, quite a few years ago, I was at the end of year masters at the O2 and I watched Michael Chang, who was coaching, I think he might have been coaching Kei Nishikori at the time, but don't quote me on that. He was stood on a meter-high box at 3/4. This was because he was playing an opponent that was 6'6". Clearly, Michael Chang isn't able to replicate that type of serve unless he stood on a box. Now, if you're a player yourself and you've watched this all the way through to the end, a massive thank you. You might want to send this to your hitting partner. And if you're a coach or a parent, put those feeds into practice. But the real key is to use them at the right moments and for the right purpose. Big thanks as always for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that thumbs up button and drop a comment if you've got any comments. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.